assurance that if he takes any decision to commit combat troops to Somalia, he'll report that decision to this House first. Can I ask about the Army's fighting vehicles? He wrote off over £1 billion of taxpayers' money in March when he scrapped the Warrior. Now weekend reports say the MOD has also paid out £3.2 billion for the Ajax, and so far only received a dozen delivered, and those without turrets. £4 billion is the total size of the government's levelling up fund over the next 4 years. And given the Secretary of State has conceded this afternoon that delivery is the MOD's Achilles heel, will he accept that Parliament now needs a system of special measures for the MOD so that British forces and the British taxpayer get much better value from his department?
I think the Right Honourable Member is looking at the special measure. The reason I'm here as the Secretary of State Defence to get the record level of investment is to put right not only 5 years or 10 years but 20 years of mismanagement of the programmes. Sometimes that means taking tough decisions. The Warrior will be retired when it runs out in 2025. It's not just going to be cancelled as such. But it's important to make sure that we also invested in the parts of the land capability that I thought, and indeed the officers thought, were the right thing for the future of the Army. The Boxer armoured vehicle, not only for that investment do we get a factory in Telford and hundreds of jobs, we also get one of the very best wheeled armed vehicles in the world. Not only does he get for his £3.3 billion of Ajax over 500 vehicles when they are delivered, and much of that money is already being committed, he will also get a factory in Wales, which I'm sure he is also pleased with, and in both projects we'll get the intellectual property, so when we export those vehicles around the world, not only will British defence profit, but also will the people of the United Kingdom through their jobs.
I'm going to say to both the Shadow and the Secretary of State, topicals are meant to be short and punchy, not lengthy debate, so for next time, can we both get it right? Let's come to Mr Metcalfe, who will definitely get it right.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I welcome the recent deployment of the Royal Navy offshore patrol vessels to Jersey to conduct maritime security patrols? Does my right honourable friend agree this quick response demonstrates the importance of having our Royal Navy vessels more continuously deployed at sea?
Mr Speaker, I certainly do. The offshore patrol vessels are an extraordinarily versatile platform. The Batch 1 OPVs, mostly responsible for homeland defence, are at high readiness and are called out for all sorts of reasons, from Jersey to escorting other nations' vessels through our waters, whilst the Batch 2 OPVs, as a precursor to the arrival of Type 31, are already operating in the South Atlantic, in the Mediterranean and in the Caribbean, and will soon be joined by further vessels in the Indo-Pacific, demonstrating the forward presence concept, which I think will have huge utility in the years ahead.
Jessica Morgan.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. With UK forces leaving Afghanistan, it's all the more important we do all we can to stand up for those Afghan interpreters and others who have put their lives on the line for our troops. But I still have Afghan interpreters in my constituency who haven't seen their wives and children for years due to ongoing issues with the MOD resettlement scheme. So can ministers admit this is an issue and work with the Home Office to sort it out?
Yes, it is an issue. It's why myself and the Home Secretary over the last year have worked very closely. We've already changed some of the reasons to ensure we bring back more, but in light of the withdrawal, myself and the Home Secretary are working incredibly hard together to see what more we can do. We owe these people a debt. It is the right and decent thing to do to stand by as many of them as possible. It is something I feel personally and deeply important to what we stand for as our values in the world. Hopefully we'll have more to announce and speak to later.
Croft.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm really pleased to hear from the Minister what his department is doing to support defence jobs. Does he agree with me that promoting the use of world-class UK-made steel in MOD projects would be an excellent support to jobs in Scunthorpe?
Although defence represents a small element of total demand, UK steel has made a significant contribution to defence, including the Queen Elizabeth aircraft carriers. While this is generally a decision for defence primes, we do ensure information is shared as part of our processes, and we do encourage the sourcing of UK steel wherever possible.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Prime Minister promised in the 2019 election that he would not be cutting the armed services in any form. We know that the integrated review plans another 10,000 fewer in our armed forces by 2025. Now, we can have an interesting discussion about whether force strength is the best use of that money or not. But doesn't it fundamentally undermine confidence in our democracy when the government seeks election promising to protect the size of our armed forces, knowing full well they have no intention of doing any such thing?
The government always goes into elections dealing with the threat as it sees it, for example. The threat has changed, and how we're going to respond to that threat is incredibly important that we make sure we do the right thing. It is absolutely the duty of this side of the House to make sure it's the facts on the battlefield change, so do we. Because he would quite rightly be the first to stand up if we didn't equip our people properly and they were put at risk. We all remember what happened last time. It was called the Snatch Land Rover fiasco, and many brave men died defending that ridiculous policy because of his government's choices.
Suzanne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome my right honourable friend's recent announcement that the Ministry of Defence will be procuring 148 Challenger 3 tanks that will be the UK's first digitalised tank. Can my right honourable friend outline how this new armoured vehicle will help deliver the modern, adaptable and expeditionary fighting force he set out in the Defence Command paper in March? And of course, keep me in mind should they need test driving.
I bear that offer in mind. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a great decision for the UK industry, especially for the West Midlands, and a great decision for the British Army. The ability to deploy world-class tanks provides policy choice for policymakers against a range of threats in our uncertain world, and state-of-the-art Challenger 3s will be a vital asset to do.
Let's go to Mohammed Jassim. Mohammed.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The world-class Cranfield University is committed to assisting the goals set out in the integrated review regarding sustaining strategic advantage through science and technology. How does the government propose to capitalize on its S&T resource investment if the large-scale, complex and secure facilities and equipment have not been invested in and so are not in place with which to conduct the research?
I'm not certain if I'd agree with the premise of the question, Mr. Speaker. We are, as the Honourable Gentleman, I agree with the Honourable Gentleman, it's incredibly important. We will be investing over £6.6 billion into research and development over the next 4 years. We have, through the frontline commands and through defence science and technology, extensive contacts with our universities. They work with us closely. We have really profitable joint workings with them, and indeed with smaller companies through the DASA schemes and the innovation schemes to pull fundamental research through onto the front line. I think we do have the processes in place, and I look forward to that money being well spent in the 4 years ahead.
Duncan Baker.
Thank you, Speaker. Over the last year or so, my office has been inundated with concerns from residents about low-flying military aircraft all over North Norfolk. Let me be the first person to understand we need military training to keep us safe. But would the Minister perhaps meet with me to discuss further how we can allay these concerns and also work out a communication plan for my residents?
I'm glad my right honourable friend used the phrase he did, because I think we're all aware, as the constituents will be aware, that we need to keep our brave air crews safe from harm as they go out every day to keep us safe. And they get to that level of proficiency through training. I'm sure he will accept that, so will his constituents. But we always want to do that with causing the minimum amount of inconvenience and disturbance, and I'll willingly meet my honourable friend to discuss the issue.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can the Secretary of State say how many infantry battalions have less than 70% fully deployable soldiers?
I can write him that in detail if he'd like. If he means deployable, or does he mean trade strength? Because there are a number of different measures. Most soldiers that are trade trained are deployable unless they're on a course, and I can give him the exact different percentages. But we measure them mainly in trade, whether they're trained, whether they're in depot, or whether they're in their battalion doing active duty.
Let's go to Aaron Bell. Aaron.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I welcome the recent reports that the RAF contributed to an important 10-day operation in April, clearing Daesh terrorists from the Makmur mountain region, which is a Daesh stronghold in northern Iraq. With approximately 10,000 Daesh terrorists still at large across Syria, will my right honourable friend confirm that the UK does remain committed to Operation Shader?
Anybody? Minister, Secretary of State.
Yeah, the government is Committed to Operation Shade, or continue to do so. The threat of ISIS hasn't gone away at all, and indeed, throughout her deployment, the carrier will also potentially take part in operations to support it. It's very, very important that we continue to degrade ISIS capability, not only the destabilising effect in Iraq, but also the threat it poses directly to us.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Can I congratulate the new Veterans Minister on his promotion to the MOD? But in doing that, can I ask him to resolve an issue that I was told 6 months ago would be sorted out, which is the rollout of the Veterans ID card? This has been rolled out to personnel leaving the armed forces, but not to existing veterans. It was announced by his predecessor, but two. His predecessor told me it will be resolved in due course. 6 months on, it would be good if veterans in my Alkmaar constituency and across the UK had an answer.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I recognise this is an important issue and this is taking too long, so I look forward to reporting back to him with an update on progress.
Right. We now have 13 withdrawn, so we go straight to Margaret Ferrier. Margaret.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The 5th Astute-class nuclear submarine was delivered a month ago after many delays in ballooning costs over the last half-decade. Given these delays, will the Secretary of State clarify if he still believes that these submarines can be delivered by the MOD by the current deadline of 2026, and if he can give us assurances there will be no further increase in cost?
So, State.
We will continue with the Astute programme. Obviously, as she pointed out, there were some delays in some of that programme. We'll continue to manage the programme. The Astute submarines will be delivered by BAE Systems in Barrow and Furness. I visit it regularly to make sure we try and keep it on track.
Richard Holden. Not here. We'll go to Richard Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Over the past 2 years, there's been 443 nuclear site event reports at the Faslane nuclear base, which is located just 25 miles from the centre of Scotland's largest city. Yet Capita, which provides specialist firefighting services on site, plans to recruit the number of firefighters by 15%, a move which has been branded as an accident waiting to happen by the Unite trade union. Will ministers intervene to reverse these cuts, given the obvious security and safety concerns that this reduction raises?
Well, I thank the Honourable for his question. Just to reassure him, there were extensive discussions with the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service before that decision was made. It was only made after a great deal of exercises to judge the effectiveness of the new system, and after it's signed off by the Defence Fire and Rescue HQ and the Commander of Her Majesty's Naval Base on the Clyde. It does reflect better fire prevention systems, and of course we also have, I'm pleased to say, new firefighting vehicles coming in later in the year. And a decision was taken to move from a 6-person 24/7 shift to a 5-person 24/7 shift, but only after that level of engagement.
I'm now suspending the House for 3 minutes to enable necessary arrangements to be made for the next business. Order. Order. I call Tom Tugendhat to ask the urgent question.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, for granting this urgent question. May I ask my right honourable friend, the Minister, to make a statement on his response to the interception of a civilian aircraft by Belarusian fighter jets over the weekend?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank my honourable friend for his question? Mr. Speaker, yesterday afternoon, a Ryanair flight from Athens to Vilnius was forced to land in Minsk. There were over 100 passengers on board, including the prominent independent Belarusian journalist Roman Protasevich. The Belarusian authorities claimed this was in relation to an alleged bomb threat. We've seen no evidence to support that claim. What we have seen is that Belarus scrambled a MiG fighter, forced the plan to divert to Minsk, then used this emergency landing as an opportunity to arrest a prominent journalist. We understand that Mr. Protasevich was detained on spurious charges, including involvement in riots, organisation of actions which violate public order, and incitement of hatred and discord. The UK calls for his immediate release and the release of all other political prisoners in Belarus. We are urgently seeking full details of precisely what took place in relation to flight FR 4978, but the scenario as reported is a shocking assault on civil aviation and an assault on international law. It represents a danger to civilian flights everywhere, and it is an egregious and extraordinary departure from the international law and the international practice that guides international civil aviation under the Chicago Convention. Of course, the international community as a whole has a shared interest, a joint stake in ensuring that civilian aircraft can fly safely and without harassment. That's why we're calling for the Council of ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization, to urgently convene to address thoroughly and rigorously this incident. The regime in Minsk must provide a full explanation for what appears to be, as I said, a serious violation of international law. Mr. Lukashenko's regime must be held to account for such reckless and dangerous behaviour. Mr. Speaker, for our part, we've summoned the Belarusian ambassador, and the Minister for the European Neighbourhood is conveying our condemnation of these acts as we speak. We are working with our international partners to explore every potential diplomatic option at ICAO, at the UN Security Council, at the OSCE, and indeed at the G7. Beyond the diplomatic track, we are actively considering and coordinating with our allies on further sanctions on those responsible for this outlandish conduct. To ensure the safety of air passengers, I've also worked with the Transport Secretary to issue a notice to all UK airlines to cease overflights of Belarusian airspace and to suspend the operating permit on the Belarusian airline Belavia with immediate effect. That is, of course, the only airline that flies regularly between the UK and Belarus, but in order to be sure and as a precautionary measure, the UK Civil Aviation Authority will be instructed not to issue any further ad hoc permits to any other carriers flying between the UK and Belarus. Finally, Mr. Speaker, we continue to support civil society and media freedoms in Belarus. We provided over £1 million in 2020, and in this financial year we're providing an additional £1.8 million. I know the whole House will join me in condemning unequivocally this reprehensible action under the Lukashenko regime. The UK will stand firm in protecting freedom of the media, upholding international law, and maintaining the safety of international civil aviation.
Tom Tugendhat.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I welcome very much my right honourable friend's statement. What he has described quite correctly as an outlandish attack is really the first time we've seen air piracy in Europe for many, many years. This attack was a hijacking that turned into a kidnapping and now is a serious violation of the human rights, not just of Roman Protasevich, who has been held by the Belarus authorities, but by every passenger and member of the crew on that airliner. This is a direct threat, not just to those who may be dissidents to regimes like Belarus, but to all of us who are at risk of overflying a state like that. Now, I welcome enormously his decision to suspend travel to Belarus and to stop overflights. He's absolutely right in doing so. In doing so, he also joins with the chairs of the Foreign Affairs Committees of Canada, the Czech Republic, Estonia, the European Union, France, Germany, Ireland, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Spain, and the United States in calling for this. Will he also go one step further? And will he call for a suspension of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline and the Yamal energy pipeline that flows through Belarus, which is where the money comes from that supports this tyrannous regime? Will he also join with European partners and friends and NATO allies like the United States in reinforcing that this was not just an attack on a civilian airliner flying from 2 EU capitals, but a civilian airliner flying between 2 NATO capitals? This, therefore, includes us and is vital to the security of the UK people that we stand strong against this. Otherwise, everyone flying to Thailand, to Australia, to many other destinations will have to wonder not only what they may have done to offend a regime that they're flying over, but even what somebody else on the aircraft, somebody they've never met before, has done. Because any of these regimes could be inspired, like them, like Lukashenko, to force a civilian aircraft out of the sky with threats of violence.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank my honourable friend for his question and for his support for the actions that we've taken today. I think he's absolutely right about the threat posed to all of us as users of civil aviation and indeed to the international community at large, not least given that the ICAO regime is one of the most well-supported international instruments dealing with a common good that we have in the international community. He's right about ICAO. We've led the calls, the UK has led the calls for an urgent meeting of the Council. Can I welcome his action amongst parliamentarians around the world? He's raised overflights quite rightly, and he will have seen and noted the decisions that we've taken today. He raised sanctions. We will urgently consider further possibilities with our partners. I think the right thing to do is to coordinate to maximise our approach. And he will know that we have already imposed targeted sanctions on 99 individuals and entities since the rigged election in August 2020, and we very much led the way at that time. He mentioned Nord Stream and other possibilities. We will consider and consult with our partners and see what further action they are willing to take as well. And finally, Mr. Speaker, I agree with much of his characterisation on the face of it. The Lukashenko regime engaged in a particularly calculating and cynical ploy to force a civilian flight to land under the threat of a MiG fighter, under the hopes of a bomb alert, behaviour which is as dangerous as it is deceitful and a flagrant violation of international law.
Shadow Foreign Secretary Lisa Nunley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. After yesterday's act of modern piracy, it is clear that Lukashenko must now be recognised as an international threat, a danger not just to his own people, but to the citizens of other countries. For a state to hijack a civilian airliner flying between 2 NATO allies in order to arrest a journalist is an assault on the freedoms of the air and on freedom of speech. Unless the consequences are swift, robust and coordinated, it will create an extraordinarily dangerous precedent that will put journalists, dissidents and activists from the UK or anywhere else at risk every time they board a plane. So I very much welcome what he said today, in particular that he has summoned the ambassador and demanded the release of Roman Protasevich and other political prisoners. The Belarusian pro-democracy movement are owed our solidarity and support as they fight for the right to determine their own future through free and fair elections. And I was pleased to hear his response to the honourable member when he asked about working with allies in NATO and the EU and through ICAO to ban flights through Belarusian airspace and to suspend Belarus from ICAO, in particular to block Belarus and from operating in and out of the UK and to suspend direct flights. And I was interested to hear him say that he was considering how to best ramp up economic pressure on the regime, because in the space of 12 months, the Lukashenko regime has stolen an election, employed brutal repression against its own people, and hijacked a civilian airliner. And yet there are fewer Belarusian entities sanctioned now than there were in 2012. So will he now bring forward sanctions against state-owned enterprises, some of which continue to have UK subsidiaries like BNK UK? What steps will he take to stop the Belarusian government using the London Stock Exchange to raise finance and sustain Lukashenko's grip on power? Will he ensure the UK is no longer a soft touch for corrupt elites from Belarus or elsewhere seeking to store their funds and assets, and consider a targeted sanctions against individuals like Mikhail Gutsereviev? And finally, given the apparent presence of Belarusian KGB agents on the flight, can he tell us what assessment he's made of the threat to Belarusians in exile and what can be done to disrupt any Belarusian agents who may be operating in the UK, Europe and in NATO allied countries? Mr Speaker, some of these things are easy, others are much more difficult, but all of them are necessary to stand up for our values and to defend our national interest. And if he chooses to take a stand on this matter, he can count on our support.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I thank the Honourable Lady for her support and for the measures that we've taken today, which she welcomed. I do think it's important on issues like this, as far as possible, subject to all the scrutiny and the accountability and the challenge that's expected, that we show a united front in the face of appalling acts by appalling regimes, of which the Lukashenko regime is one. And I agree with her characterisation, as I did with my honourable friends. The Lukashenko regime has done something here which doesn't just threaten its own people, but attacks a common good, most notably endangering a key tenet of the international system on civil aviation. That is a threat that accrues to us all, and we must stand up and uphold it. She mentioned sanctions. I'm not sure her numbers were quite right, but just for clarity, we've sanctioned 99 individuals and entities. That is a mix of those sanctioned under the country-specific sanctions regime, but also the extra individuals that we sanctioned as a result of the global human rights regime that I introduced. On top of that, in relation to corruption, she would of course know that we've extended the Magnitsky sanctions regime to cover corruption and embezzlement and improprieties of that nature. She mentioned a couple of names. She'll understand that we're evidence-based, but I would encourage her, if she's got evidence or she thinks that there are individuals who should be designated, to let us have that information. And then finally, I think she raises a very important point, which is clearly now there is a threat not just to dissidents and journalists who have the temerity to stand up to the regime inside of Belarus, but to those around the world. With our Global Media Freedom Coalition, which we work very closely with the Canadians on, with a whole range of other mechanisms internationally, it is important that we stand up for those freedoms and those individuals wherever they may be.
Mr Speaker, the outrageous kidnapping of Mr Protasevich has rightly received unqualified condemnation from across this House, but it is just the most recent in a despicably long list of opposition politicians and journalists who've been arrested or disappeared as part of Alexander Lukashenko's latest appalling crackdown on legitimate opposition. So can my right honourable friend tell the House what action he and the government are taking to strive to secure the release of all political prisoners in Belarus?
Can I thank my honourable friend, and I know, obviously because of his background, how particularly personal it is when he sees journalists arrested, detained or otherwise mistreated around the world. I agree with much of what he suggested, as I made clear in my opening answer. We're supporting civil society in Belarus, including the millions of pounds that we're pouring in to support civil society and journalists. We have called for the release of all political prisoners. We've done that from day one. We did it when we first triggered as well, of course, the Moscow mechanism as part of the OSCE, and we continue to engage with leading democratic figures, including Mrs. Tikhanovskaya, and we shall continue to do so.
Alan Smith, SNP spokesperson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'd warmly congratulate the Chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee bringing this urgent issue to the House today, and I'd very warmly welcome the Foreign Secretary's announcements about the overfly and flights of Belavia. There's a clear breach of Article 3 and 4 of the Chicago Convention, but it's almost unimaginable that we've seen over the weekend a state hijacking of a civilian aircraft going between two EU and NATO capitals. This cannot stand, and we must work with our international allies on this. The Foreign Secretary will be aware that the European Council is meeting this evening. Can he commit now to engage with that, as he has said, but also to mirror the response when it's agreed, and obviously that hasn't happened yet. But to go a bit further in terms of expressing solidarity, but actually giving practical aid to Belarusian activists, journalists and agitators, making asylum easier to claim within the UK for these brave individuals. And can I ask also what assessment his department has made of Russian involvement in this action? And it seems unforeseeable that this could have just been a unilateral act by Minsk. There was surely some Russian involvement, and would he have consequences for the Russian state as well as the Belarusian state? when things are decided.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I thank the honourable gentleman, thank him for his support for the statement, thank him for his support for the measures. He referred to breaches of the Chicago Convention. I agree with him, they are striking and shocking. He also referred to what coordination, or asked what coordination we were engaged in with our EU partners. I think this is a very good example of where we, of course, notwithstanding departure from the EU, will, of course, on key foreign policy issues, want to coordinate very carefully with them. We've done that before. In fact, he'll recall that after the rigged election, we led the way, but coordinated very closely with our European partners when we imposed Magnitsky sanctions. Finally, he asked about Russian involvement. We don't have any clear details on that, and I'll be careful what I say at this point, but as he says, it's very difficult to believe that this kind of action could have been taken without at least the acquiescence of the authorities in Moscow, but as I say, it is unclear as yet.
We're going to Maria Miller. Maria.
And can I welcome my right honourable friend's statement, because the events yesterday were, as others have said, effectively state hijacking of a commercial passenger plane. But this is just another episode in Lukashenko's campaign to silence opposition to his regime, both within and beyond the Belarusian borders. There's no room for this type of behaviour anywhere in the world, let alone in Europe. My right honourable friend has set out the immediate action he is taking, but what is he doing to support a peaceful transition to a democratically elected head of state in Belarus? And when will he be meeting Svetlana Tikhanovsky, the opposition leader in Belarus?
Secretary.
Can I thank my right honourable friend and commend her on raising this so tenaciously as she always does. I've had positive discussion with opposition leader Svetlana Tikhanovskaya. I spoke to her in February. The European Minister has also spoken to her previously. We will continue that engagement. It's very important. We make the case for free and fair elections as soon as possible according to international standards. We certainly support, as we did at the outset, not just the Moscow mechanism, but the implementation of the recommendations from Professor Benedek on the need for elections and his findings in relation to human rights abuses. Of course, my right honourable friend asked the key question, which is how we can go from sanctions, supporting civil society, to actually encouraging some form of democratic transition. I have to say to her that the Lukashenko regime looks very dug in. It has the protective umbrella from Moscow, and I think that what we saw over the weekend was a symptom of that and a sign of that. I think it's incumbent on the international community to keep up the very robust pressure as far as we can, increase it wherever we can, and also to use every mechanism at our disposal. And I think the key difference here from what we've seen previously is that the actions of the Lukashenko regime are not just targeted at their own people, they're attacking an international common good reflected in the Chicago Convention. That gives us at least the ability with our allies to work to apply pressure in that forum. We'll continue to do that.
Let's go to Tony Lloyd. Tony.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The fact that the Lukashenko regime operates with a belief in impunity is not surprising. We know this, but this state piracy is most definitely a new step, and one that does require a response that is seen to be proportionate. In that context, can the Foreign Secretary return to this question of the use by the Belarus state through its subsidiary companies operating in the United Kingdom as to whether we can apply pressure on those to prevent the state having access to resources that come through this country of ours? And in doing so, can we coordinate with our European Union allies? Because this is something that the Belarusian opposition most certainly have wanted to see. Tough action, but tough action against a leader who's lost all sense of credibility and legitimacy.
Can I say I totally agree with the instincts of the honourable gentleman. I'm not sure that it's correct that there are businesses taking advantage of it, but what I can reassure him is that we will look very carefully amidst the panoply of measures that we now consider as to see what further pressure we can apply, and that would include any further tightening of restrictions on access to the UK or other financial markets with which we see passing through London.
Mr. Speaker. Today, I issued a media statement on behalf of the entire UK delegation to the Council of Europe condemning the actions of the Belarusian government and of President Lukashenko. We call for the immediate release of Roman Protasevich and all political prisoners in the country, and some of us have already befriended such prisoners to provide them with hope and comfort. But is this not a time when it should be considered that an international warrant should be issued for the arrest of President Lukashenko on charges of terrorism?
Well, can I thank my honourable friend? I think in order to mount a case of that nature, you'd need to have quite specific and clear evidence. And of course, that's for the CPS and other law enforcement authorities to consider. But can I commend him, and in the international bodies that I mentioned, which we must press to hold the Lukashenko regime to account, actually I didn't mention the Council of Europe, and although Belarus is not a party, that is an important European forum for us to apply pressure amongst the wider European international community, and can I commend him and the UK delegation for all the work that they're doing.
Let's go to Leila Moran. Leila?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I start by joining in those who are welcoming the Foreign Secretary's statement and the actions taken so far. From the violent crackdowns on protesters last summer to the terrible repression of journalists, which of course has now escalated to what is state-sponsored air piracy that has put civilians at risk, it is clear that the Belarusian authorities have no regard for democracy, for human rights, or the rule of law. They act with impunity because they know that Russia has their back. And while we'd all love to believe that this will be the last we hear of this, I think we all know that that is unlikely. The UK hosts the G7 soon, and that is an opportunity to raise the events in Belarus and coordinate further international action. So will the Foreign Secretary consider putting Belarus on the agenda of the G7?
Can I thank the Honourable Lady? We're already doing it, but she's quite right to say that the G7 amidst the other forums is something like this should be considered, not least because of the attack on the international system via the Chicago Convention and ICAO.
Mr. Speaker, this is not just a state-sponsored hijack of a civilian aircraft between two NATO capitals. We know from the Belarus media that it was ordered by Lukashenko himself. This is an international crime that requires the strongest response, and while I welcome the stopping of overflight and a UK lead on this, increasingly both Belarus and Russia don't care what the international community thinks. Therefore, all our allies need to act in synchrony, including some of the weakest links, or tyrannies all over the world will see that air passengers are increasingly put at risk.
I thank my right honourable friend. I agree with his instincts, and in particular I was in Estonia and then Oslo recently, precisely because of the importance amongst our Nordic and Baltic partners, key NATO allies, of strengthening and reinforcing the stance that they take, both in relation to Russia, but also the emanation of those threats that we've seen in Ukraine and now in Belarus.
Christian Matheson.
Speaker, I welcome the statement on what was clearly an act of piracy by an illegitimate government that puts it firmly in the rogue nations bracket. But does the Foreign Secretary share my concern that this now becomes a tactic of these rogue nations that may, unless there is a firm response, use again? And no aircrew could possibly ignore a threat of a bomb or some other threat to the aircraft and would have to divert to the nearest airfield. So it's putting not just this flight at risk, but potentially many more flights at risk and the safety of their passengers, unless we can come down much harder on the perpetrators.
Can I thank the honourable gentleman? He's absolutely right. That's why we've taken the actions that we need to take in relation to flights to and from the United Kingdom. That's why we've called for an urgent meeting of the ICAO Council in order to address these issues in the most appropriate forum. But let's face it, this also represents a threat to international security, and that's again why we have raised it in the United Nations Security Council.
Andrew?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome the statement given by the Foreign Secretary? Can I also thank the honourable member from Henley for the excellent work he's showing in the Council of Europe? Does my right honourable friend agree that Lukashenko must accept that his recent actions are a step too far and that the only way forward for Belarus
is for the dictator to halt his campaign of oppression, release political prisoners, and hold free and fair elections with international observers.
My honourable friend is absolutely right. I agree with that list. Ultimately, it is difficult to see how Belarus, under the Lukashenko regime, can take any steps out of its pariah status unless those things happen and unless there are free and fair elections, which would inevitably lead to a change of leadership.
Let's go to Dame Diana Johnson. Diana.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The European Federation of Journalists has called this kidnapping from a civilian airline an act of air piracy and state terrorism, and it's difficult to disagree. And as we know, basic freedoms and human rights are being eroded in Belarus. 29 journalists are now detained. So along with having the most robust and effective sanctions targeting this rogue regime, what action will the Foreign Secretary be taking to investigate the possible involvement of other states in this criminal incident?
Well, the Honourable Lady is absolutely right that sanctions are part of the strategic approach, but not the only aspect that we need to look at. We will, of course, look very carefully at the involvement of anyone else, although gleaning evidential standards of information, I think, is often very difficult. What we are doing is, as I mentioned before, supporting civil society in Belarus, the additional 1.5 million programme support over the next 2 years. In March of this year, we allocated a further almost £2 million worth of support for the media in Belarus. We need to use every lever at our disposal, not just to put pressure on the regime, but also to try and glean some of those answers, the answers to some of those questions that she rightly raises.
Dr. Julian Lewis.
May I underline what the Chairman of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee said about the dangers of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline in this context? Now, when adopting this aerial adaptation from the Putin playbook of how to deal with dissidents, Lukashenko clearly was expecting an outcry. But already we're hearing suggestions that we mustn't be too harsh against Belarus, because otherwise we'll be driving him further into the Russian embrace. Will he ensure that no such argument of appeasement will be accepted by him and his fellow ministers?
Well, I can give my honourable friend exactly that assurance. The fact is that Lukashenko is already ensconced in the embrace of Moscow. The question is how we can prise the leadership away from that. It must be a mixture of the pressure that he rightly calls for, as does the chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, but also a willingness to have the door of diplomacy left ajar should more pragmatic voices within that regime be willing to take the positive steps forward. But ultimately they must end in free and fair elections. That's what the OSCE investigations have called for, and that is what the UK will stand for.
Tricia Gibson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We can all agree that the most robust international response to this shocking act of aviation piracy is essential. Otherwise, Lukashenko's methods could potentially embolden other despots in the view that democratic nations lack the will to back up their outrage with meaningful action. As well as the coordinated international action against Belarus that the Secretary of State has spoken about today, what other support does he think can be offered to protect and assist human rights defenders in Belarus?
Can I thank the Honourable Lady? I think she asked a very timely question. And in reality, we've got a number of levers, but let's not pretend they're a silver bullet. We're providing, and we are continuing to provide, the support for civil society and media freedoms and media organisations. We apply the Magnitsky human rights sanctions, so there's pressure and we hold to account those who persecute either protesters, political figures or journalists, and we raise it in every international forum we can, from the Human Rights Council to the United Nations Security Council, and we will use our presence in the G7 to keep the flame of freedom burning for those poor souls who are in detention, whether they're journalists or political figures.
I want to congratulate my constituency neighbour and the Chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee for securing this urgent debate, and welcome the Foreign Secretary's very swift statements how to respond to this hijacking. But I want to push the Foreign Secretary a little bit further. I am anxious that the tactics used recently will encourage other curious countries, and what confidence can the Foreign Secretary give to journalists, activists or other individuals who are sanctioned for spurious reasons in case their lives may now be at threat? What work can be done to strengthen Western allies to ensure that their safety is met? And with your indulgence, Mr. Speaker, piracy has been mentioned a few times, and as the previous Maritime Minister, I can't let this point go. Does the Foreign Secretary agree with me that the tactics played out may encourage countries such as China, who claim sovereignty over the whole of the South China Sea? A third of the world's maritime trade crosses through those waters, and if China could claim the right to intercept any ship or any plane crossing over the South China Seas...
Order. Can I just say to the... Order. To the Honourable Lady. I allowed a little latitude, but I think it's a bit much to take complete control of the debate. We do want short questions. Foreign Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank my honourable friend? I think she is understandably worried about the wider international implications of this. What I can tell her is that one of the things we discussed at the G7 meeting of foreign ministers is the importance of not just addressing country by country these issues, but the thematic protection of the international order. So I've already mentioned the Coalition for Media Freedom. On top of that, we were discussing support for the other Canadian-inspired initiative to counter arbitrary detention of nationals or indeed dual nationals abroad. I'm thinking in relation to Iran, but more generally. And on top of that, she will know that, and I hope the House will know, but if not, that in March we launched the International Accountability Platform on Belarus to collect, verify and store evidence of human rights violations. That initiative was led by Britain, Denmark and Germany. We've got 20 states in total supporting it. We've provided money towards it, and that allows us to gather the evidence, not just to call out these abuses, but as some have mentioned, to pave the way with evidence for prosecutions when that is feasible in due course.
Mr. Speaker, does the Foreign Secretary recognise the criticism by many in the Belarusian diaspora that the response to last year's stolen elections was too soft? And will he get tough by imposing sanctions on Belarusian individuals and companies, including the UK arm of the state oil company, BNK UK Limited?
Can I thank her? And I think we all want to stand up for the same issue. I have to say, having spoken to a range of the key figures, that's not the feedback we've had. In terms of the UK response, at least, we engaged very swiftly, well before the EU, in fact. After the rigged election, we imposed sanctions on 99 individuals in total, if you include the Belarusian regime, but also the Magnitsky sanctions we imposed. But I take a broader point. We need to, I mean, it's not a question of tit for tat. It's just a question of making sure we exercise every potential due diligence to stand up and hold to account those violating these human rights, and I think, which was her point, making sure that we seal every crack so that there is no possibility of those businesses linked to the regime making money in this country.
There's no doubt that Belarus is now a rogue state, and Lukashenko should, I mean, he's a criminal, and I hope that he will spend many years eventually in prison. I want to celebrate the phenomenal courage of the politicians, the activists, the ordinary members of the public, and of course the journalists who've shown something that none of us would ever even dream of having to make those kind of sacrifices in the UK. But I have a terrible fear that every time we discuss these authoritarian regimes and we issue another statement, we're basically throwing another snowball in a river. When are we actually going to take serious measures to make sure that these things do not go unpunished?
Well, can I thank the honourable gentleman? I've campaigned on these issues with him for many years, and he's always a very eloquent, powerful and tenacious, articulate advocate. I wasn't quite sure the action that we could take, that he thought we should take, but I'm open to all suggestions in a spirit of openness, and we need to marshal all of our resources. One of the issues which I haven't mentioned, and so with permission, Mr. Speaker, is that we're also one of the largest shareholders in the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development. So just for completeness, we fully support their announcement that it will no longer support Belarusian sovereign funds. So I do accept the argument that we need to look at every possible lever, but as I think he's alluding to and implying, this is not easy when you have a regime as dug in as the Lukashenko regime so clearly is.
Christian White.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wish to thank my honourable friend for securing this urgent question today, and the Foreign Secretary for his statement on this very serious attack on civil liberties
and the free press. I welcome the sanctions already placed on the illegitimate Belarusian regime through the government's newly established global human rights scheme. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that standing up for our values with sanctions on human rights abusers like Lukashenko must be a key part of global Britain's new foreign policy approach?
Can I thank my honourable friend? I think not only should it be, it is, as set out in the integrated review. We stand up for our values, the values of open trade, of open societies, including human rights and democracy, and that means holding to account those who perpetrate these violations, standing up and keeping the flame of freedom alive for those poor souls who are languishing in jails, whether it's in Belarus or elsewhere around the world.
Samuel Wilson.
Mr. Speaker, there's no doubt that this was an act of air piracy designed to abduct a critic of this tyrannical regime, and there's also no doubt that the regime has been emboldened by the law-breaking exercises across the world of the Russian regime. And I think it is important that the Minister does take every action with every possible body, whether it's the EU, the G7, the financial institutions, private investors, anyone who can hurt this regime, to send a message out to them and to any who would seek to copy them, that this behaviour will not be tolerated and there will be financial, personal and political consequences.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I share the honourable gentleman's disgust and outrage. The Lukashenko regime is slipping further and further into pariah status. We will take every measure we can, whether it's at a diplomatic level, whether it's sanctions or more broadly, in order to stand up for the values, particularly freedom of civil aviation, stand up for the values of human rights, but also crucially to send a message around the world to others that this kind of behaviour will not be tolerated.
Let's go to Damien Collins. Damien.
Thank you, Mr. Kidnapping of Roman Protasevich is the worst example of what's been a systematic campaign by the Belarusian government against journalists. Last year, there were 480 detentions of journalists who spent more than 1,200 days behind bars, including at least 62 cases of physical violence against them. My right honourable friend agree with me that we need to send a strong message to Belarus and other oppressive regimes that this is an attack on democracy and legitimate free speech that won't be tolerated.
Totally agree with my right honourable friend. We raised this precisely with this kind of systematic attack at the G7, and we will continue to do so. I say the G7 Foreign Ministers meeting, and we will continue to do so.
Let's go to Marion Fellows. Marion.
Speaker, while we have a long-standing position of challenging the results of Lukashenko's fraudulent election win last year, we have to be honest and say that this represents a departure from these entrenched disagreements and represents a direct attack on the citizens of our EU allies and on international law. Given that plain reality, it's right that sanctions up to and including the freezing of Belarusian state funds are effected. But what new measures will the government consider for granting asylum to those suppressed by the Lukashenko regime?
Can I thank the honourable lady? And asylum has been raised already. I have to say, I think that the asylum regime, the criteria reflective of international law, are fit for purpose, and the evidence of the regime's despicable actions mean that that those who want to apply for asylum in this country are able to do so and will get the fair hearing and the due process that our system allows.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the Foreign Secretary is quite right to call for the International Civil Aviation Organisation to take action. Given that its aims are to sit at the centre of a system of safety and security standards for its 193 members, and that Belarus is a member, will he call for ICAO to look at the continued membership of Belarus of such an esteemed international organisation?
Can I thank my honourable friend? I certainly agree that ICAO must discharge its duties. It's a dramatic but seminal moment for it to stand up for the values that we're all trying to safeguard in relation to civil aviation. We will look very closely at with our partners at the mechanisms and the levers that are available to us within ICAO, and we will take as rigorous and robust approach as we possibly can.
Let's go to Claire Hanna. Claire.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The SDLP and I condemn in the strongest possible terms the actions of the Belarusian government and echo what others have said about the importance of sanctions and of holding Lukashenko and his Russian protectors to account. This is the latest attack in recent years on journalistic freedom, including the horrific murder of Jamal Khashoggi and the imprisonment on entirely trumped-up charges of Nazarene Zaghari Ratcliffe, and closer to home, intimidation of journalists here in Northern Ireland by paramilitaries. What action is the Secretary of State and his department taking to cooperate with other countries committed to a free press to uphold the rights of journalists and to challenge attacks on freedoms of speech and journalistic integrity?
Foreign Secretary.
Can I thank the Honourable Lady? She raised a great point, which is you have to, in order to exert positive influence, coordinate with your allies. So we need to broaden the group of like-minded countries willing to take that action. I think she can see the evidence of the initiatives that we're engaged in, both the Media Freedom Coalition, which is advising states on how to strengthen their legislation to protect journalists, but also we give particular financial support to those journalists who do find themselves detained. And more broadly, one of the things we discussed at the most recent G7 Foreign Ministers meeting was the arbitrary detention mechanism, which is effectively saying that when one or other of us, part of that mechanism, find one of our nationals, or it could be a dual national, arbitrarily detained, we all démarche, we all take action in order to try and secure their release.
Mr. Speaker, Western flights continue to transit over this unpredictable airspace. I hope the Foreign Secretary will make it clear that this does need to stop. But for a European state to fake a terrorist threat shows how our international standards are being challenged. And other authoritarian states will be watching how the West responds, how resolute we are, how unified we are in our response. He listed a whole bunch of international organizations which no doubt will condemn what's happened. But will it affect Belarus's behavior? Will it change Lukashenko's attitude? We need to make sure that we think bigger picture and recognize that a quarter of Belarus's trade looks towards the West. I do encourage the Foreign Secretary to make the changes that will affect Belarus's behaviour in the longer term.
Can I thank my honourable friend, the chairman of the Select Committee? I agree we need to use every lever. I'm not quite sure what the specific one he thought would be the decisive extra measure that would bring Lukashenko to his senses, but I'm very interested in continuing to talk with him about that. The reality is Lukashenko becomes more and more reliant on Russia. I take the points that my honourable friend made about that. We must not allow that to be a reason to ease up on the pressure, but we've also got to be realistic about how dug in Lukashenko is. We've ruled out nothing that we wouldn't do going forward. I think the most important thing is we try and carry a broader group of international partners. And the reason that is particularly germane in this case is because the ICAO and the Chicago Convention represent an international public good.
Let's go to Clive Efford. Clive.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm delighted to hear the Foreign Secretary say that the government is going to be taking a very tough response to this act of air piracy. But can the Foreign Secretary say, does he detect any sense of reticence from his counterparts in other countries in their response, and any suggestion that they might be suggesting that we should be taking a softer approach in order to win round the Belarusian regime?
I thank the honourable gentleman for his support. Look, there'll always be different views across the European family, and I'd be a bit reluctant about advertising that to Minsk or to Moscow for obvious reasons. What I would say is we are in the business of supporting some of the most vulnerable of our European partners, and that's why I was out in Estonia to talk to the Baltic 3, and I went to Oslo to talk to the Nordic 5, and I've invited all of them back to the UK to host at Chevening, because I think this support that we provide to that periphery of the European neighbourhood is absolutely crucial to supporting fellow NATO allies, European allies, but also the message we send not just in Minsk, not just in Moscow, but around the world, as honourable members have said.
Garpa.
Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful to the Chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee for applying for this urgent question, and for you, Mr. Speaker, for granting it, because it's been clear both sides of the House, I think, are united behind the actions the Foreign Secretary has taken already on behalf of the British government. But can I ask him this? In order to make sure this doesn't happen again from the Belarusian government or from anyone else, the price paid by that government must be sufficiently high. And also, can I ask the Foreign Secretary what work is underway to look at other countries which are the sort of countries that might be tempted by this, to see whether there's any preemptive action that we might need to take to make sure that British people flying around the world are kept safe and none others are put at risk by this sort of behaviour by this state or by any other.
Can I thank my honourable friend? He raises a very important point. I think, first of all, we will use all the sanctions that we've got at our disposal, or all the levers we've got at our disposal. I think we're conscious, as we've already discussed and others have said, about the extent of increasing reliance on Russia, but that cannot be a reason for us not to take the action we take. I think the thing which is unique about this, I can't remember, maybe dating back to the 70s, but I can't really remember an analogous case like this. It is very rare. There's sometimes through a more cock-up-than conspiracy actions that are taken, sometimes very tragically in relation to aircraft being shot down. But this kind of rather calculated and conniving approach with the MiG jet and the hoax, the bomb hoax, I can't remember another precedent like this. But I do think he's right to reinforce, as others have done, the deterrent effect of how we respond to this specific isolated incident.
Let's go to Alistair Carmichael. Alistair.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome the very robust political and diplomatic stance that the government is taking? But this case is more than that. This is a potential human tragedy as well, with Roman Protasevich now in detention and possibly ultimately facing the death penalty. I know, having campaigned in different parts of the world myself, that consular and embassy staff are very effective in the way in which they deploy their resources in supporting people campaigning against the use of the death penalty. Can the Foreign Secretary give me some assurance that everything that can be done to keep this case in the public eye will be done within the confines of their role in country?
Can I thank the honourable gentleman, the right honourable gentleman, and say I totally agree with him. We must do everything we can to signal that as outrageous as what they've currently done is, it would be yet a further step into pariah status if the death penalty were to be applied. I thank him for what he said about consular officers. Of course, they relate to and provide services to British nationals and dual nationals abroad, but nonetheless, the broader point he makes about diplomatically keeping the pressure on and doing everything we can to avoid the death penalty, I think is a very important point for this debate.
Daniel Koczynski.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to congratulate my honourable friend, the Chairman of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, and our friend from New Forest East for mentioning Nord Stream 2 pipeline. Bearing in mind that Lukashenko doesn't do anything without the authority of Moscow, I think their comments are particularly relevant in this debate. But can I ask the Foreign Secretary what additional steps he's going to take against President Lukashenko? We already know that there are certain sanctions in place against him and his cronies. Is there anything else that the Foreign Secretary can do specifically about additional British sanctions on this dictator?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I say to my honourable friend, yes, we'll look at the panoply of sanctions on individuals, sectoral sanctions. We'll coordinate with our partners as to whether that's appropriate. We'll take action in ICAO in the way that we've described because of the importance of securing civil aviation, but we'll also raise this issue in the United Nations Security Council because of the threat it poses to more broadly international peace and stability.
Dave Dugan.
Mr. Speaker, as an aircraft engineer and student of international relations, I am perhaps especially outraged by this brazen assault on international norms and the deliberate endangering of an aircraft by means of military force. For Lukashenko to have deployed the apparatus of the state to effect an act of vengeful piracy against flight FR 4978 rides roughshod over the international system and cannot, as the Secretary of State has outlined, go unchallenged. So will he commit the UK and underline the UK's role within an international coalition to effect the utmost in sanctions, including freezing of assets against the Lukashenko regime? And does he agree with me that if the international community is now looking on aghast at a step change in delinquency by a state actor, shouldn't people who are thinking of mirroring this also look on aghast at the consequences that the international community puts out?
Yes, I think he's right about the action that we take and also the deterrent effect it has. We've got, I think he mentioned asset freezes in relation to 99 individuals and entities already in place, but we will, of course, as I've already said, look right across the full range to see what further action we should take and look to work very closely with our international allies about which options to take forward.
Order, I'm suspending the House for 2 minutes for the necessary arrangements to be made.